Russia will be winning this cognitive war as long as there are people prepared to betray their country's security interests for their own individual political profiles. Putting Ukrainian victory above everything is what I'm going to define as being useful. And then you judge them based on that objective. Maybe someone will come along who will pause the war because it's not useful for them to make money, but there's no one who is going to systemically change Russia. Oh, Ukraine's fighting back too much.
We were talking about that. That's imperialistic approach.
Yes.
Our land is untouchable.
Yes. One step from there to, can't Ukrainians just die quietly without making so much fuss? Please don't call on us to lead.
Russia is trying to convince the world that it remains strong, stable, and fully in control. But Ukrainian drones are reaching deep inside the country. Pressure is growing within the Russian elite, and even some Western figures who once repeated Kremlin narratives are beginning to reconsider their positions. First, the myth of Russia's powerful army collapsed. Now the myth of its powerful propaganda may be next. Let's discuss all of it with Jonathan Fink, founder and host of a YouTube channel, Silicon Curtain. Jonathan, it's a pleasure to have you here. Finally, you arrived and you are in our studio. Welcome.
This is fantastic. Thank you for your generous invitation here, and it's a huge honor and pleasure to be here.
So, Russian dictator Putin recently said that Joseph Stalin gave the western of Ukraine, the part of the western of Ukraine to Ukraine as a gift. And sooner or later, this part will be taken again by Poland, by Hungary, by Romania. This rewriting of the history, do you think it's gonna make him stronger? Or, I don't know, my guess is he's trying to poison Ukrainians with this kind of a thinking that we have enemies around everywhere, like Russia, Belarus, but still on the west of Ukraine, we still have Romania or Poland or Hungary that are our enemies. What's your take on that?
I'm not sure it's directed at Ukraine, in fact, because he may believe it works in Ukraine, but anyone who's spent any time here knows that this is not going to work. Everyone looks at this as if, like, what on earth is he talking about? However, I think this is directed at Hungary. It's directed at Poland. It's directed at Romania. I don't think in Hungary necessarily there's, a huge hangover of, let's say, imperial ambition or post-imperial trauma, although Orban perhaps would suggest otherwise, but they got rid of him. In Poland, there's lots of weird stuff going on. And I think amongst some, especially of the conservative right, conservative Christian nationalist right in Poland, there is a certain desire for a fantasy imperial territory, or at least being a regional hegemon. So unfortunately, I'm going to say that Putin is not as mad as we might think. He knows there are historical divisions. He knows there's unresolved historical trauma. His memory, I think, as a Chekist, of how Stalin used all these hatreds and grievances to divide and carve up Europe, is fresh. It's fresh in his mind, and we are the ones who've forgotten how that all works, unfortunately. But some of that is still buried there. So this is worrying, because I think he has a point.
But what about other countries who will try to resolve this historian trauma with Russia?
It's a can of worms. I mean, look at a map of Germany and how much territory Germany lost. Big chunks of German territory, especially Prussia. Prussia practically disappeared. It's now part of Poland. Yeah, if we open up that historical can of worms, we're going to have what Timothy Schneider, calls bloodlands again. And I think Putin's ardent desire and wish is to open up that historical can of worms, to create a bloodlands territory where everyone is divided, everyone is slaughtering each other, everyone has grievance and hatred and loathing. And that's the way that he thinks Russian imperialism can reassert itself. That's not the only deluded thing he said in his recent speech. He also talked about, of course, Ukraine not being real and, history ultimately showing that Ukraine wasn't a thing and the language and the territory identity weren't real, and history will resolve all these unnatural places in his mind. I don't think that's true. Anyone who's spent time in Ukraine knows that it's Ukraine that's defending Western sovereignty, even if Poland doesn't realize it. The only thing defending and preventing, let's say, another partition of Poland is not the might of the Polish army. It is Ukraine. Ukraine is defending all of European sovereignty. Unfortunately, Europe is slow, is weak, is reactive, and is appeasing. And there are many forces who are just waiting to be able to do business with Russia again. And I think there's certain things that Putin understands and has correct. When it comes to Ukraine, he gets it wrong every time because he has no understanding of how Ukraine works and thinks and acts.
Jonathan, yesterday I had a short, brief interview, or I would rather say it was a huge B-roll with a MAGA supporter and Trump's ally, Laura Loomer. For 1 week, she was visiting Kyiv, east of Ukraine, Dnipro, Kharkiv, 30 kilometers from the front line, and or 30 miles, as she said. So basically, she was trying to find, as she said, Nazi here, and we don't have any, of course. But my question is not about Laura Loomer, but more about this tendency of people like her consuming Russian propaganda and then admitting that they were wrong. There was a public confrontation with Margarita Simonyan before she going to Ukraine. She posted it, and Margarita Simonyan became mad, and she exploded. This is the head of Russia Today. So do you think that's a good tendency of such a people? Because I said that once people, the world believed in that Russia has the second world powerful army, and they don't. Now people think that they have a very powerful propaganda, which they do. I mean, the propaganda is super strong, they have. But still, maybe something is cracking inside even such a powerful Kremlin machine.
Something is cracking. I mean, they are losing some of their assets and agents. I don't think Laura Loomer was necessarily a formal asset or agent. The fact that she's actually had this mea culpa suggests that, one, she probably believed quite a bit of what she was repeating, but ultimately it's expedient. It's politically expedient. They will use these narratives where it helps their own internal political agenda. Even if, the stuff they're repeating about Russia, I doubt whether they even thought for 5 seconds about what it actually meant or dug any deeper than that. It's just useful. It sounds vaguely plausible. Right, we'll use it. And unfortunately, there are many, many people, I think, throughout not just America, but throughout Western Europe as well, and Eastern Europe, who are quite prepared to use Russian narratives to drive their own internal political platforms. Russia will be winning winning this cognitive war, as long as there are people prepared to betray their country's security interests for their own individual political profiles. And unfortunately, we haven't had a major war in Europe for decades. And I think many people have now got out of the habit of understanding that defense and security are greater than individual political profiles. In Ukraine, I think that lesson has kind of mostly been understood, although under the surface, there is, of course, a lot of movement. There's a lot of people trying to build their future profiles, but they actually understand that you don't damage current security for the sake of your political ambitions. Most seem to understand that. Unfortunately, that's not the case in Western and Eastern Europe. So as long as this remains the case, Russia will find new useful idiots and new assets. They'll lose some, but they will gain just as many people who see some individual advantage, political advantage, in utilizing Russian narratives. And also Russia now has means to support people indirectly. They don't have to give an envelope full of rubles. They can digitally boost someone's profile. It's completely indirect. It doesn't even have to be taken as a bribe or even illegal under our anti-corruption laws. They can indirectly boost the profile of people and help build a digital profile, which gives revenue to certain assets without that being formally declared. So unfortunately, the tools and the motives are there for it to continue to be very powerful and effective and divisive.
Right. Jonathan, in a recent Carnegie Politic article, Tatiana Stanovaya, she argues that Russia is approaching a political crossroads. Putin is pushing the system toward further escalation, while parts of the elites increasingly want change and no longer believe the Kremlin's goals in Ukraine, they are realistic. Do you think that that's what is really happening?
We have to define what change means. And we had this article with an oligarch in The Economist recently.
Oh, yes.
Yes, the great agent of change. What's Melnichenko, I think it was called, something like that. Anyway, this is unfortunately a very easy narrative for many in the West. If you believe there's an opposition in Russia, even within the system, if you believe there is an opposition in, say, Navalny's team and others that has a realistic chance of gaining power and then changing, we have to ask, what do they mean by change in this circumstance? Are they going to change the entire economic model, the vertical of power, the parasitic way in which the whole of Russia is organized and resources distributed? Are they going to uproot the kind of Japanese knotweed of the Siloviki? No, there's no one either systemic or even who positions themselves as opposition who have any plan to dismantle the security state in Russia. So maybe someone will come along who will pause the war because it's not useful for them to make money, but there's no one who is going to systemically change Russia. And I think until we accept that, until we have a plan for, I'll be a little bit radical here, not for Ukrainians, but for Western audience, until we have a plan to dismantle Russia entirely as a political imperial entity and dismantle its economic architecture that feeds the Siloviki, then this aggression, violence is simply going to mutate into another form and is going to repeat either continuously or every generation.
Absolutely. I was reading just a fresh article of some economist observers. They were saying that Putin gave an order to find money they don't have now as much as they wanted for this war, at least for the next 3 years. And unfortunately, as me personally, I don't see any end of this war sooner or later. Just sooner, definitely no. So I don't know. I thought that type of a contradiction that I told you, and from this article, I thought that eventually that's going to tear apart Russian empire, this region.
Unfortunately not. As they say, I have experience, na bolotach, as they say. And, people talk about them being able to take a lot of trauma. Well, we see all the videos of whinging privileged Muscovites complaining about lack of petrol. Now they can't get their stuff delivered, within 24 hours from Wildberries because it's all going up in smoke. These people have no agency and no power. They have no courage either. So what I think is going to happen in Russia, yes, the market economy, the very superficial layer that could convince itself that actually we're no different from Western Europe and we have nice things and blah, blah, blah. That is possibly going to disappear very, very soon. But it's going to revert back. It's going to be a phase shift. So rather than thinking of a collapse of the Russian system, no, it's going to shift phase into a higher gear of repression. It's going to, if you have a time machine, they're going to set the dial to 1934 or whatever it is, and here we are straight back. So yes, it will shed the superficial vestiges of a Western market economy, and a lot of people will lose those privileged lifestyles they created. But there's no political agency, there's no political organization, there's nothing underpinning that class of people. There's far less political organization and consciousness in Russia now than there was in, say, 1917. Russia was closer, I believe, to the West before the revolution than it is now.
In one of your recent videos, he said that Putin is getting, helping to Russia to dive into 90s, something like that.
I think we're going way beyond the 90s. At the moment, the dial is being set for the 90s.
Yeah.
But the 90s weren't, people are going to find this odd. The 90s weren't that bad. They were terrible, but they weren't that bad. Why? Because people had a certain belief in a future. They believed that, okay, things are really bad now. I almost swore there. Things are really bad now, but you know, actually we've got more money than we had a few years ago. Our fridges are full, or our fridges are starting to fill up again, and despite hyperinflation and everything, we're still alive, and we can see a way through to tomorrow. That's gone now. That's completely gone. And soon all the little luxuries and privileges will be gone. And I think they're setting the dial in their time machine back to the height of Stalin's purges. That's the phase shift we're going to see into a fully centralized, far more repressive system. And what I've been tracking in some of the videos is they have built the architecture of the digital gulag. It's not the sort of consumerist dystopian future of the Chinese one, which monitors your every move and rewards behaviors. Now, that's quite a subtle Orwellian sort of vision. In fact, it's more like a Brave New World. You know, China's built that ecosystem. Russia is far closer, of course, to 1984, or for those few who've read Mui by Zamyatin, it's far closer to that kind of dystopian vision. They've built the digital architecture for that. All Putin has to do is to click his fingers sometime in September, and no one will be able to buy train tickets. No one will be able to buy fuel, either physically or even if fuel's available, without proving, you know, let's say they've got military papers or whatever, or not due for call-up. They won't be able to go anywhere, pay for their car, their insurance, get healthcare. He's built the cage, the digital cage is there, ready and waiting to slam the borders shut and to close down all bank transactions. And I think that's a phase shift into the next thing. It's not an end of the war, it's not a collapse, but it is a movement into a far darker system. And then in a kind of, you know, like a medieval Bosch painting, Putin is going to channel or shovel the remaining Russian population into the meat grinder until there's nothing left.
Wow. You know, recently I had an interview when I've heard the quote saying that you wanted Russians go to the protests because of this war against Ukraine. But now we see that the only one protest and their motivation to go is to support the regime because of the successful strikes on wild berries. How do you see the strikes, and can it be that Ukrainian army and Ukraine itself unintentionally will force Russians to go on the streets, or just for more active mobilization? Just asking.
Yeah. I mean, there's two things there. One is I think that, let's start with Ukrainian strategy. I've been saying for some time, I don't pretend that anyone's been listening, but I've been saying for the last couple of years that the only way to push Russia to take more risky steps and to weaken it is to attack the privilege of the, let's say, the luxury cities of St. Petersburg. If you think of it like the novel The Hunger Games, they are the people in the capital living very ephemeral and ridiculous lives surrounded by, you know, the districts. So that's kind of exactly what it is. I think the Ukrainian strikes are technically, and what they're saying to allies is, yeah, no, these are dual use, they're selling military goods, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's the primary strategy here. I think the primary strategy is to attack the privilege of the Russian elites, bring the war to them, make it real for them, reduce support for Putin. Not because I don't think people are sitting there doing this strategy thinking that's going to trigger protests. They know it's not. They don't think it's going to trigger revolution. It's not. They may be thinking that this could trigger some oligarchic reaction, or some group within maybe the FSB might take Putin out because they can see it's gone too far. But I think realistically, they're also thinking that's quite a low probability. What it's doing is degrading Russia's capacity to earn money through its taxes to pay for the war. And it's also bringing the war home to the privileged elite. I think that is the key point, but it's not going to result in revolutions and protests. There's no political sense whatsoever outside of, let's say, personal privilege and understanding perhaps, or empathy with your immediate family and friends. I don't think it extends to anything abstract to a wider group. That doesn't exist.
Yeah, because you know why I'm also asking? Because I was reading Medusa, which is not, I'm not a great fan of it.
Do you read it in English or Russian? Because
Russian.
The versions are different.
Seriously?
Seriously. There are subtle but minor differences in the English version, which you won't get in the Russian version.
Well, what it's telling us about the Medusa's approach to its viewers, because the recent article was about the Ukrainian deep strikes into Russia, especially about wild berries, and they just collected all the different views of Russians, but the title was like that: we understand what's happening with our head, but deep in our heart, we will not forgive you. It's Russians telling to Ukrainians. And I'm like, seriously, is that the title?
Yeah.
Why you should forgive us? For what? We are not forgiving you ever. But
That shouldn't be a surprise. I'd quickly share an anecdote. So the first days of the war, someone who I used to know quite well in St. Petersburg, who worked in the media, actually. They won't be watching this because they've fled the country and they're in South America somewhere now. But just before they fled, they did go on some protests. This person's a similar age to mine and has young children, and she ended up in the what do you call the wagon where they she ended up in a detention center, but she was taken in the police wagons that they drag people away from protests. So she did that twice until the point where they
a Zag.
The Zag, yeah. So she ended up there. She wasn't beaten. Fortunately, she was released. And this was in St. Petersburg, where I think some of the protests were a bit more intense. But they only lasted for a few weeks. And then they started, excuse the language, then they started beating and raping selectively, and then reducing the tape, actually producing the tapes to dissuade other people from protesting. So there was a very clear strategy to try to use absolute, let's say, surgical terror to prevent more protests. So I communicated with that person. And I said, this is horrific. Yes, she agreed it's horrific. She mostly agreed that Russia's to blame, although this narrative that NATO is probably equally to blame, even amongst the opposition, is completely...
Oh, God.
It's like an onion. You peel away, and you will always get down to a narrative, no matter what the superficial layers of the onion are. You'll always get down to some propaganda nonsense eventually. But she said this really interesting phrase. And this is already while Ukraine is being bombarded. She says, this is terrible, but of course it will be worse for us.
Okay, what did she mean? Did she explain?
No. So you could read something deep into that, which is eventually we're returning to Stalinism and we'll be destroying Ukraine and we'll be destroying ourselves. You could read it as that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure at all.
I sometimes when I hear some good Russians, and they're saying, well, we feel your pain, but we also fled the country and probably we will never get back to Moscow or St. Petersburg. I'm like, don't even dare to compare it.
Yes, unfortunately so. I did an episode which had some unfortunate side effects, which I won't talk about here, but I did an episode called There Are No Good Russians. Not because, what I was saying is, that doesn't mean there aren't good people or there aren't people who might be good to their immediate families or whatever. What I meant is, this isn't a useful concept for Western journalists, Western institutions, politicians. This is not a useful concept thinking of good Russians because it's emotional, it's emotive, it's easy to manipulate, and it's not objective. How do you define good? What do you do with that? I said, look, have the concept of either useful or useless Russians. And let's face it, 99.9% are going to be useless. But you have to define what useful means. And in this context, I said, putting Ukrainian victory above everything is what I'm going to define as being useful. And then you judge them based on that objective. And here are 10 questions you ask them. Obviously, the number one, is Crimea a sandwich? Right? If they don't pass,
absolutely.
If they don't pass
that's just the first question. We're going further or not.
But it goes deeper and deeper. Until about question 6 is, do you support long-range kinetic sanctions, which includes refineries, wildberries? Question 7 is, do you support the Kursk incursion and maybe other incursions into Belgorod and so on?
That's a good list.
Now, this is interesting because there are many Russians who actually contributed to the ZSO in the early part of the war, who did various things. And then when Kursk came, it's like, oh, hang on a second. Oh, I'm not okay with this. Like, oh, Ukraine's fighting back too much.
We were talking about that. That's imperialistic approach.
Yes.
Our land is untouchable.
Yes. Yes. We can punch you in the face as many times as we want, And actually, as an oppositionist, I'm going to feel a little bit sorry for you, but don't you dare punch us back in the face.
Yes, well, yeah.
Unfortunately, many Western governments think the same.
That's the problem. That's the problem. But I just want to finish my point about Medusa. I wanted to mention not that one, but another one. They reported that on a leaked Kremlin instructions that was spotted. And on these instructions, they were telling state media to portray Ukrainian strikes on oil facilities, on Wildberries warehouses, as attacks on ordinary motorists and the small businesses. Well, and I thought maybe that's narrative means that the Kremlin is seriously worried that people could go on the streets and like ask, stop the war, because Ukrainians have their own right to attack like warehouses and oil facilities.
I'm going to counter that. I don't think Putin cares. We know that. He doesn't care about the population. But I also don't think he credits his own population with any agency at all. We know that because he doesn't credit Ukrainians with any agency. When Ukraine fights back, in his mind, this is probably more to do with, Prekляття Anglo-Saxone, or the perfidious Albion and the dreadful West. He even now can't credit Ukraine with the strength to fight back, which it clearly is. Even less so does he credit his own population with any kind of power to resist. So I don't think that's the point. What I think is they believe this is a very useful narrative in the West, especially in Germany and other places, where people go, well, yeah, hang on a second. Yeah, why are they hitting warehouses? Why are they hitting this? What's going on here? Like, we supported Ukraine when blah, 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 but now, oh, maybe they're going a little bit too far. These emotional Ukrainians, I know you have to feel a little bit sorry for them, but they're really going too far in defending themselves. And it's one step from there to, can't Ukrainians just die quietly without making so much fuss? Please don't call on us to lead. Don't call on us to take any action that might face the reality. We want to live in our little luxury bubbles. Please don't trouble us anymore to think and feel.
Wow.
I think of this with the film The Odyssey coming out. I really think of Ukraine as, you shouldn't use the word heroes, because I know speaking to a lot of veterans, it's quite triggering being called a hero. For them, the heroes are the people who haven't made it, who've died or lost limbs. But there is something of the Bronze Age of heroes in Ukraine. It's the only country willing to physically and mentally stand up to the new wave of authoritarianism, the new wave of darkness that's sweeping across the world. And it's no coincidence that I think many people that I've spoken to really empathize with things like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, these stories of dark and light and making enormous sacrifices, almost with no hope of actually winning, but you have to fight anyway. And it's put in stark contrast, I think, with the West, who are, at this point, most governments, leaders and populations are not willing to make any of the sacrifices, say if, or rather when, they're called upon to do so, when Russia or the other authoritarian states attack them. Unfortunately, I don't think there's really almost any other country on earth that would fight in the way Ukraine has. Maybe Taiwan, but this worries me. And this conversation I've already had this morning with someone about this, that there isn't the understanding, the appetite, the imagination, the empathy, the historical, let's say, depth of understanding about the Cold War or the darkness that emanates from Russia repeatedly. That understanding was partially there in the Cold War. It's gone completely. And I fear that Ukraine is the only rock poking above the water, and everything will be covered by darkness if we allow these authoritarians to continue. And I'm going on about this a little bit, but again, a conversation I had this morning is that the West, and I use the West sort of broadly, so many countries and even individuals who are pro-Ukraine say, but we've given so much and we continue to give so much, as if that's the thing to focus on, not the end result. Has Russia been deterred? Has Russia been defeated? That's the thing to focus on. But no, everyone's just focusing on ticking a box, doing their thing, making their individual conscience feel better. What we've actually done is been presented with a lethal pathogen, which is Russia, and we've put the antibiotics in half doses continually to the point where we've helped that pathogen build an immunity to it. We've made Russia stronger by not dealing with it in 2022 or 2014 or 2008, and especially through the full-scale war, we have helped to build an enemy which potentially will overwhelm us in future years.
Yeah, I'm worried about those people. You know, a lot of people are so worried about global warming that it's going to kill the planet or kill them. And they are not worried enough about Russia's threat to all the countries. That's still surprised me. Maybe that's a wrong thinking, but sometimes like you're so active in those questions, which is right, of course. But I mean, Russia's threat...
You're just emotional. You're being emotional again, you know.
Well, I've heard it.
Yeah.
When I was at the beginning of a full-scale invasion, I was at the United Nations Correspondent Association in New York, in the United Nations headquarters. And I said something like about Russians, and they were like, "Oh, you shouldn't say that." I'm like, why? My people are dying.
A friend of mine was fired from his senior academic job because he went to an event, not even associated, I won't say the names because I don't want to get into further trouble, but he's a leading expert in certain material science in one of the leading universities in the UK. But he's an active Ukraine supporter. The institution knows that he comes here to build and test drones. And he found himself at this event that wasn't even an official university event. And someone invited a Russian. And he was introduced to that person. And he was like, okay, I'm going to ask you a question. A little bit like my, there are no good Russians. I'm going to ask you a question to see whether we proceed further in this conversation. And he asked him, basically, is Crimea a sandwich?
Crimea, yeah.
Is Crimea Ukraine? And the person said, well, that's very inappropriate question. I'm not going to answer it. And he carried on asking and asking and asking. And this was filmed, and it unfortunately got on social media. And then he was called into his department and fired for that.
I guess not the Russian was fired.
No. Unfortunately, until we deal with that, and he's stating a position which is aligned with international law, which is aligned with the position of technically United Nations, aligned with the position of NATO, aligned with the position of his own government. And he didn't beat the guy up, although he would have been well within his rights to do so. He simply asked a question and didn't get the answer that would have been, an absolute foundation. Now, I want to counter that a little bit. When I produced that episode, I have some Russian friends in Europe, and they were a little bit upset about the episode, but they passed a message saying, I did your test, and we got 9 out of 10. And I'm like, okay.
9 out of 10, and what
you're useful. You are therefore useful.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I only wish we would come to this with some strength of will and mind and logic, strategic logic. But all these things are lacking, unfortunately. The other one to tackle, of course, is great Russian literature. Because I think one of the things that is providing real immunity from many in the West thinking about Russia in a strategic way is this. It's almost like a sort of vaccination. It's like, yes, Russia's doing terrible things and Putin, but great Russian literature, and it allows people to not think coherently from that point onwards.
I thought, when is going to stop?
This unfortunately is not going to stop. I went to a recent event with, and there was an academic who originally is Russian. Her first phrase in this, and actually she's quite interesting. She studies power structures and power networks. Yeah. And she started looking at, Russian power networks from the time of Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible onwards. She's done some incredible work. And the first thing she said in this event was, I haven't spoken Russian for 16 years, even though her husband and family are Russian. And she said, I haven't spoken Russian for 16 years because I needed to decolonize my own mind to get a much clearer understanding of how these power relations work. Fantastic. I thought we're in for a really great conversation. Then it gets to the Q&A and the audience. The questions were just horrible. Despite what she'd said and setting the, the scene for that, all the questions were like, oh, I know, politics, blah, 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 but, I just love my Russian literature. And I'm like, Okay, which is your favorite bit? Which is your favorite bit with the, the bad guy with the axe, sticking it in someone's head for no good reason, with anti-Semitic undertones? Which bit about that do you like the most? And I could go on because I've actually read some.
Okay, yes, you read some.
Yeah. Which is the bits of Dostoevsky's journalism, for instance, that you find most enthusiastic about? The deeply anti-Semitic, deeply paranoid, isolationist kind of weird brain dribble that he called journalism.
Yeah, I remember I was a kid and I'm reading about Raskolnikov and I was like, what the heck is going on there?
What is this?
Why should I read that?
And somehow it's heroic. I mean, it's heroic to commit horrific crimes. It's heroic to have no real sense of guilt for it. It's heroic to then be imprisoned and punished for it. And heroism is in not actually fully, going on a process, getting away with stuff, which brings us on to Masha and the Bear, in fact. Because I think Raskolnikov and Masha and the Bear have quite a lot of stuff in common, which is we're going to break your nice things and behave in an atrocious fashion, but it's okay because we're going to get away with it.
Brilliant, Jonathan. Well, I have still a few questions. Once I realized that more and more foreign correspondents or just foreign politicians, guests coming to Ukraine, I thought they will be maybe they will not stop Russia from aggression, but I thought there will be like the voice of the world, of the West here in Ukraine. They will show all the picture happening here, like even Laura Loomer or someone else. Because while she was here, I thought Kyiv will not be attacked while she's here, and she's going to be our next air defense like Keith Kellogg, which that's not happened, but still. So I thought more and more Western representatives would come to Ukraine and they will somehow stop Russia. And why it's not happening? Why Russia is not even scared of those people calling their bosses to Washington, New York, Brussels, and Paris, saying, this is crazy, we're like sleeping in a bomb shelter. And no, Russia's like, I don't give a damn about that.
I think it's because how far do they experience it now? And one has to say Boris Johnson has gone a little further than most. He's got a documentary out where he actually has gone to, I think, Kharkiv and Kherson, Zaporizhia. So he's gone to high-risk places.
Yes.
I mean, he still looks remarkably ridiculous in Bronzhilivka, whatever he wears, he manages to look absolutely absurd.
I haven't seen that documentary.
Yeah, it's a 90-minute documentary, Boris Johnson on the Eastern Front. It's coming out, or it's just come out.
Oh, okay, because I haven't heard of it.
Yeah, it's just literally this week it's come out. I haven't seen it yet. Okay. And he looks extremely comical in his, his protective gear. But
he looks extremely comical even without.
He does. He looks comical in every possible.
Without the vest.
He kind of looks like his body's about to spill out of whatever clothes.
That's part of the image.
It is part of his image, absolutely. Yeah. I've actually seen him in real life once. He walked past a mirror on the way to a conference, and his hair was looking unusually tidy. And he looked in the mirror and was like, "Oh, well, that's," and then messed his hair up. Like, okay,
yeah, I had an interview
back on
with
brand.
him twice, and before the interview, he was doing like that.
Of course, yeah. But full, good on him for going out there, going to somewhere which is genuinely risky, and I don't think there's anything he can gain politically from continuing to talk about Ukraine, and yet he does. And his role early in the war, in hindsight, was quite unusual compared to the hesitancy of subsequent politicians. So I'm going to give him some points for doing that. But obviously he wants to. I think he actually, from his studies of Churchill and from his own maybe rather grand ideas of his own place in history, of what he'd like his own place in history, I do think he has an understanding of the historical moment. He has an understanding that this is a moment no less significant than 1939 and 1941. He can place that, and he can imagine himself with a role in that. Unfortunately, I think most of these politicians who come out for photo calls here are just doing that. They're ticking the boxes. They're doing something that adds a little bit of personal prestige, makes them feel good, and then they move on and blah, blah, blah. They're not engaging with what it actually takes to win and why winning is important here, because they do not have the historical context. They do not have the absolute empathy. And even me, you know, this is I've lost count. This is my 7th, 8th, 9th trip this year so far. Even then, only going to Kharkiv did I really appreciate some of the intensity of what people are going through, which was my last trip. And I was staying with a family. That was the first time I was actually with people with young children experiencing an air raid. And again, it added an extra angle to my understanding and empathy of seeing their reactions. And just seeing, like, you've got outgoing artillery, you've got the buzz of drones outside the window, you've got shaheeds and stuff, but they're not moving the children into the corridor for that. That's just like, yeah, that's just happening. It's only when the ballistic warning comes in or there's a particular sound of some kind of incoming rather than outgoing, you just see this sense change. They're like, okay, everyone in the corridor. It's just this snap like that. And realizing that people's threshold for what they consider danger is completely changed. I hadn't experienced that with a family, and it's difficult to empathize until you've actually experienced it. And I think that's the problem. It's not until these drones are crashing into skyscrapers in London, into those lovely glass and steel buildings by the Thames, that anyone is actually going to wake up. Even seeing it in the Middle East, in Dubai and so on, yeah, there's a few people who've woken up to, hang on a second, we should be thinking about this a little bit more, who are maybe on holiday in the Middle East. No, most people are going to remain asleep, including politicians, until it's their families that are losing members, until it's their shiny buildings that are getting smashed up, unfortunately.
Just a few weeks ago, I had here a therapist and psychologist, Lisa Woods, and we were talking about the trauma of that our body remembers, but also about the kids' trauma in Ukraine. What's going to be next? Because we're fighting with the real physical enemy of Russia, but then it's going to be the serious consequences in Ukrainian society. And I'm so, I don't know. But from other hand, yesterday I spoke with my colleague. He went to the front line. He's now on the Sumy region. And I told him, like, I feel like the Ukrainians are mentally cracking. It's not like it was even in 2025, 2024. Lots of things are changing. I see that among a lot of people around me. I see it in me that I cannot be happy as I used to be happy. And I'm not happy with that changes. But he said that we are holding on much better than everybody could expect. Yes. Because, as you said, we don't have any experience like that in the world. Yeah. That for the last at least 5 years, we have a severe war.
I think this is the thing, and I'm going to say something a little perverse here, because I don't wish this trauma on anybody. But this trauma for the children growing up is almost like an immunization against future authoritarian slide. The number of people who have experienced bad leadership, the number of people who've stepped up and become leaders and better managers in this war, Ukraine's going to have a greater quantity of real leaders and experienced people than any other nation on earth. And if we look back at the Second World War, the amount of trauma is extraordinary. It wasn't dealt with. I have many relatives who fought, uncles, grandfathers, great uncles, etc. And that trauma was never really dealt with, and it affected them for the rest of their lives. But if you look at the subsequent decades of the 50s and 60s, we had a generation of leaders and people who were relatively empathetic, which led to stronger politics in the decades following the Second World War. One of the problems that we've got now is that generation's gone, and anybody with direct experience of dealing with that and functioning in a full-scale war, they've all long passed out of memory. And that's one of the problems with dealing with this problem. And even the generation who dealt with Russia in the Cold War, many of them now entering either retirement or have passed on. Ukraine is going to have an extraordinary, supply of leadership, which might be squandered, who knows, but at least you have, I think, the chance, perhaps, of inoculating yourself against this future, well, at least building a fortress against all the problems we talked about, which are almost inevitable in the world. Last thing there, which I think you'll find slightly amusing, I was talking to someone this morning about here it was, and we were talking about this, how do you get the West to change? She suggested building a, you know, like you have these, not holiday camps, but you have these places where you go for arcades and, you know, what do you call them? I can't know. Theme parks, that's it. You go to a theme park.
Yes, yes.
She said you should build a gulag theme park in the West, and then give people the real understanding of what being occupied by Russia is. And you'll enter that theme park and you'll be beaten within an inch of your life, and you'll be sodomized, and you'll have all your nice things broken, and you'll be psychologically broken down. And I think her point was facetious.
That's a great idea, a great point. Jonathan, thank you so much.
The lawyers might have some issues with that.
But anyway, yeah, we may manage that. Thank you so much for your time. I think, yeah, listening to you, I'm realizing that I really hope that I can be a post-war generation, but unfortunately, I think I will not be a post-war generation. Well, anyway, thank you for your time, for coming here. It was wonderful. You have a great energy. Thank you. And thoughts and ideas. So thank you for standing with us with Ukraine.
Дякую дуже.